How will we power our future? Can we create a healthy and clean economy? Climate One at the Commonwealth Club is at the forefront of the global debate about energy, economy, and the environment. Bringing together the brightest and most provocative leaders of our time, Climate One is the place where big ideas get heard. With thoughtful and insightful discussions on policy, business, science, and culture, Climate One founder Greg Dalton gets to the heart of the matter. It's our future. It's time to come together.
Today on Climate One, we're talking about China going green. Also, we're discussing the potential for hacking the sky. First, we discuss science and technology, coming up on Climate One.
And Dr. Pachauri, a lot of the policy world is focused on what governments can do or should do. What do you see as the role of business, Apple, other companies in tackling climate change, given the constraints they have to their shareholders?
Well, I think you really need to look at it firstly as a long-term challenge. And even if you look at the history of businesses anywhere in the world, it's those businesses which had a vision and that were able to foresee the future that actually turned out to be far more successful than others that only worried about the profits in the next quarter. So I personally think that you need all stakeholders to be on board. You certainly need government. Government has to set in place policies that enable action in this area. And you need businesses with vision, with leadership that focuses not on immediate and short-term benefits, but looks at what its standing with society would be. And I have a feeling that today, reputational value is very important for a company. When the public demands companies to be more responsible in terms of protecting this planet, I'm sure that will also translate into value in the stock market.
Lisa Jackson, Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, created quite a stir last year when he responded to a call, I think it was either an annual earnings meeting or a call for someone, shareholder meeting, someone criticizing Apple's expenditures on clean energy. And he said, if you're just interested in bean counting, basically, get out of this stock. So how does Apple balance long-term investments in clean energy and the quarterly demands of Wall Street?
Well, first off, it's probably good for this audience to get a sense of just how invested in clean energy we are. We run data centers. We actually run 4 of them. All 4 of those data centers run on 100% clean energy today. So whereas a lot of people are setting goals for how we want to move our data and the cloud to be clean, Apple's section of the cloud is clean today. That didn't happen by accident, and although I'd love to take credit for it, we were well on our way to doing that before I got to Apple a year and a half ago. And so you start first with the kind of innovation that's required to take a challenge, and certainly that is a challenge, and say we're not going to be held to what's been done in the past. We're going to just go ahead and prove that it can be done. That takes innovation. And then you have to say, you have to really believe that there's no need to choose between a thriving economy and growth and doing right by the planet and its people.
Dr. Pachauri, I clearly remember being in Delhi at your conference, and there's diplomats and experts from around the world, and someone stood up from the Maldives, and the room got very silent. For them, this is an existential issue. These are people who contributed very little, who their way of life and their country is going away. So talk to us about the moral dimension of the Asian Pacific countries that are threatened by what we've done.
We have clearly highlighted the ethical, the equity, and the larger dimensions that really should motivate us to take action. And one of them certainly relates to those parts of the world which are really vulnerable and are in fact suffering already. One of the points that I'd like to put forward is the clear finding that we brought out in a special report in 2011, and which we've also included in the 5th assessment report, the fact that extreme events are on the increase, and 2 types of extreme events in particular, heat waves and extreme precipitation events. Now, I certainly can't scientifically link any single event to human-induced climate change, but the aggregation, the trend, and the entire picture that's now before us and observations going back over time clearly show that the intensity and frequency of these extreme events is on the increase. And if we don't do anything about this problem, then clearly these are going to become far more difficult to manage. So much so that in some parts of the world, we would see that those heat waves which currently take place once in 20 years, by the end of the century, could occur once in 2 years. So, looking at some of the most vulnerable regions in the world, and the fact that they are inhabited by some of the poorest sections of human society, there is obviously a moral dimension to the problem, which we've highlighted in the fifth assessment report of the IPCC. In fact, I might mention the synthesis report, in its 50-odd authors, had a philosopher. Because, this is not something which relates only to hard science, where you only look at the physical basis. There's human society which has to be taken into account.
Lisa Jackson, one of the most vulnerable areas in the United States is New Orleans. You were there during Hurricane Katrina. Tell us what happened, what you did there.
So I grew up in New Orleans, 9th Ward. New Orleans is a decent part of the city, actually sits below sea level, so is protected by levees. My mom's birthday is August 27th. Happy birthday, Mom! And early. And so I had gone down to see her. We watched the Saints game that night, which is you have to do if you're in New Orleans. I woke up the next morning and found out that this storm, which we had heard was heading for Florida, had actually turned. Thankfully, after some cajoling, I had to get my brother on the phone, go figure, my baby brother, but he finally convinced her that we had to go. And so I drove her out of New Orleans. I think it was the day before her birthday. I remember putting her in the car. She refused to pack anything because if you grow up in New Orleans, you don't run from a hurricane. That's what the tourists do. They get on a plane and they go, or they have a party in a hotel somewhere. And I just said, Mom, we should just go. And my brother lived in the northern part of the state, so the idea was to go there. So she didn't pack anything, and I packed a few things, grabbed just a few things, including the deed to the house. And I remember as we drove off, I went, "Bye, house," as a joke, trying to get her to laugh. And although the house was still there, arguably, after Katrina, you can't imagine, or you can see all the pictures of what a house looks like when it soaks underwater for 2 weeks or so. We lived in an area of the city that was traditionally and was actually built during segregation, so it was an African American area. It was middle class, and not one of those houses was out of the floodplain, so every one of them, the levees broke in the lower 9th Ward, and then the water just filled in, and so that there were people who died in our neighborhood. Luckily, my mom was not there for that, but she lost everything she had. We lost our home, and once you've gone through any kind of disaster, you can't hear those stories ever again on the radio about a flood in some distant place the same way. When you say that something that used to happen every 20 years or 50 years is going to start happening every few years, you can't hear that and not remember the years it took to get my mom and the family back together. The convulsions of that city over who could rebuild and where they could rebuild, and the threat that the civic society, the society would be pulled apart by people's belief that they weren't going to get treated fairly. And in some ways, as horrible as that was, and Irene after it, you can't say it was fortunate, but what are you going to do when you're the 12th in a row and there's no more money left? There is no cavalry to come running because we don't have it anymore. That's the moral issue.
Since the beginning of the last century through 2010, the average sea level rise in the world has been 19 centimeters. That's close to a foot. If we don't do anything about this problem, and we don't have additional mitigation, then by the end of this century, we could get sea level rise as high as 98 centimeters. That's almost a meter. So you can imagine there are parts of the world which are barely a meter above sea level. And well before that, storm surges, coastal flooding, and extreme events are going to make it impossible for people to live in these locations.
Then let's talk about some of the technologies that you think that are most promising. Where can technology, solar is probably one of the brightest stories out there. There's a lot of solar happening in India. It's advertised all over the place. Let's talk about the bright spots in the technology. Dr. Pachauri.
If we want to limit temperature increase to 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, then by 2050 you need a 40 to 70% reduction in emissions over the 2010 baseline. Now that's pretty drastic. What does that mean? It means that you need a trebling or a quadrupling of zero or low carbon energy supply. So that means a sharp change in the energy supply mix that the world is currently accustomed to. We've also said that by the end of the century, you have to have zero or negative emissions. Now this means that you'll need substantial improvements in energy efficiency, a large utilization of renewable sources of energy, possibly nuclear if there are societies that want to adopt nuclear, carbon capture and storage, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and among all the technologies and all the policy options that are going to bring this about, another important issue is going to be changes in lifestyles and behavior. Now, this doesn't mean that we have to go back and live in caves and wrap ourselves in sheepskin. But what this does mean is getting rid of waste. Perhaps changes in diet.
Dr. Pachauri, India, more than 1 billion people, a lot of aspiring consumers who want to live like Americans, have the lifestyle that we enjoy. How's that play out in a climate context?
Well, let me first mention that in the case of choosing and adopting a low carbon sort of pathway of development, there are huge co-benefits. I mean, the first co-benefit that I'd like to highlight is energy security. The second would be improved air quality at the local level, and in general, a much better environment at the local level. There's also growing evidence that you get much higher employment from some of these options. I mean, you can't deny people choices that are obviously coming into their living spaces and are at their doorstep. But this is where I think Gandhi, in a sense, was right. He was once asked, wouldn't you want India to become as prosperous as Britain? And he responded, look, it took Britain to use half the resources of this planet to reach its level of prosperity. How many planets would a country like India require? So I think if everybody in India wants to live the American dream, then I think there's going to be a problem. And I think we'll see that problem very soon. So I think the government and the people are realizing that. We had a solar energy mission, which was formulated in 2010 for setting up 20,000 megawatts of solar capacity roughly in the next 8 years or so. The new government is planning to up that to 100,000 megawatts. Now, that's a stiff target, but it signals the signs of change and a desire on the part of Indian society to deal with climate change effectively.
Let's go to our audience questions. Welcome to Climate One at the Commonwealth Club.
This is a question for Dr. Pachauri. I wanted to ask you about the 2 degrees, which for this audience is 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, which sounds a lot higher for us, so that might be good to use for Americans. It's a big raise in global average temperature. If it's so difficult for us to get to where we need to get to 2 degrees, if we have to make such drastic changes, and we know that after these 2 degrees or 3.6 degrees, that we will have a lot of calamitous changes on the planet, Is 2 degrees really enough for us to strive for?
Is 2 degrees sufficient?
I think
Or 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit?
That's something that science really can't determine. I think that's something that society has to decide. But science tells you directly that even with a 1 degree increase in temperature, there are certain species that are going to be threatened. Science also tells you with a 1 degree increase in temperature, you'll still have sea level rise, and sea level rise will continue into the next century. And that there are extreme events that are going to continue and become much worse. So I think what the IPCC is doing is placing all the information that it can come up with, that it can assess before human society. And I think with the level of awareness and understanding that hopefully will be created and is being created, we would be able to arrive at a resolution of whether it should be 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees or whatever.
But that's a social value judgment. Let's go to our next question. Welcome.
I'm wondering whether you think climate justice is different from environmental justice, or whether you think it's a part of it. I think some argue that it's completely different because it affects the entire world. Climate affects the entire world. And environmental justice focuses on localized communities, but I'd argue that they're a lot alike because of who's affected by climate justice issues. So I'm wondering what you think.
I definitely think climate is bigger than an environmental issue in many ways. You know, it covers every aspect of an economy. It's why so many people get engaged in debate, from food to water to air, certainly air quality, but land use, lifestyles. We've heard it all tonight. So you get a sense of how big an issue and how come so many, treasury ministers are just as interested in climate as environmental issue ministers. So that might be the easy end of the story, but I just want to, focus in on the justice question. I think, as Dr. Pachauri said, there are co-benefits. So when you do something to move to cleaner energy, you get a lot of other benefits. But when you have dirty energy, you get a lot of bad things travel along with that. The kinds of communities that have historically been neglected, where health is an issue, where asthma is an issue, where water quality and land use is an issue, those tend to track with other issues of income in our country. And unfortunately, still in many places, there are vestiges that also track with race. And so I think there are very valid and important considerations. They sort of go to the last gentleman's question. I do think about the workers. I do think that we need just transitions and leadership in our country that says, as we move, as we transfer, I'm less worried about corporate welfare as I am about the people who will need training and skill development to be able to live and have a just economic transition for them and their families. And I absolutely believe that's part of the role of government.
Coming up, geoengineering. There's a group of people involved in developing the inkjet printer at HP. How does that relate to geoengineering, the inkjet printers that many of us have in our homes and offices? How does that relate to painting the sky?
Let me just first make clear that you understand, none of us really advocates geoengineering, right? We're saying, look, the research should be done. None of us reasonably would defend that you're going to deploy this.
So let's use that inkjet printer or a glass of milk and explain for us simply what we're talking about. Spraying mist into the air that reflects the sun back?
Well, this is a relatively simple idea that basically you use the clouds like a mirror. And clouds are white, it's just like a glass of milk, right? So if I take milk, it looks very white. And if I dilute it, then it gets gray. And there's nothing white or gray in that whole milk. There's just little droplets of, there's water and there's little droplets of fat in it, and the combination of multiple scattering gives you that color. So what happens in the clouds that are gray, they don't have very many droplets, or they're quite big. And so the idea is that if you can help by a natural means to bring more droplets in there, nuclei as they call it, they will become droplets too, and you will have more scattering. So it will look lighter. The clouds will
So clouds are mirrors. You can make the mirrors stronger and reflect more heat up into, bounce it back into the atmosphere, and it won't warm the Earth into space. Alan, this sounds like playing God. Who gets to play God?
Well, this is a very interesting question raised by these various techniques that fall within the rubric of geoengineering. I mean, one of the reasons why geoengineering is a controversial topic is because it's talking about potentially trying to influence the climate at this very broad scale, akin to perhaps, you could say, playing God. And the question is, of course, who would do this? And ultimately, ideally, this decision would be made by the international community, by humanity as a whole. How would that be made, though? There's all sorts of questions regarding, well, could one country do it on its own, or even an individual who had the financial means to try to do this? So all sorts of difficult questions regarding how you would actually manage a scheme like this, even if you could somehow agree to go forward with it.
Ken Caldeira, how much research is happening now, today? Who's tinkering with the atmosphere?
We're all tinkering with the atmosphere with our greenhouse gas emissions.
Anyone who driving in their car now is tinkering with their atmosphere, fair enough.
But nobody is intentionally trying to alter the atmosphere, and nobody is now engaged in any outdoor experimentation with geoengineering.
They've held off on going forward because of this sense that they don't have yet a social license. And the idea behind the social license is that they're concerned about the reactions that might take place, and they also want to, I think, have a sense that whatever research is produced, the research results are legitimate and will be accepted as legitimate. But so at this point, we're kind of at a standoff, is my sense of it, where we have a growing number of researchers who are interested in doing some field experiments.
I see that a little differently. I think there's quite a few people who are ready to do small-scale, very low-risk experiments that are looking at actually how the chemistry and the physics actually occurs. These are small, relatively small, and they try to look at the mechanisms by which particles form and how they reflect, and whether or not they impact the ozone or other things that would be deleterious. They're ready to go, but there's no money. There's no funding for these projects. It's the government that is holding back on the social license.
Ken Caldeira, you're part of a group that's funded by Bill Gates, that there is money there. So what is Bill Gates' motivation, and what's going on with his money in this area?
Bill Gates has created a small fund known as the Fund for Innovative Climate and Energy Research. And I can't speak for him, but I think he feels that this is an area that the government should be funding. But because the government's not funding, he stepped in to support some small amount of work doing computer modeling and laboratory experiments. And I think he just sees this as a research area that's underfunded and is trying to step in to fill a gap.
Jane Long, what do you think about for-profit or private funding of this type of research?
I think it's really important that the government fund the actual physical experiments, the kinds of thought experiments and workshops and things that are being done through private funding. I have no problem. But once we get to any kind of an outdoor research project, you very quickly want to see that become programmatic and become strategic.
Alan, what do you think about private funding and sort of for-profit motivation and how this could be governed? And should this be something that's only funded by the government?
Well, I think private funding is a concern. I generally agree with what Jane said about the need for this, whatever field research activities take place to be subject to public accountability and transparency. And that's much harder to do when you have private funding going on. Some of you may be familiar with an incident a couple of years ago where an American businessman undertook an ocean iron fertilization project out in the Pacific. there's some disclaimer on his part as to whether that was a geoengineering experiment or not. Many people perceived it as a geoengineering experiment, given the background of that particular person involved. And that was essentially privately funded. It was funded by a Native American tribe up in Canada, which was actually seeking enhanced salmon runs. But arguably, it was also a type of geoengineering research which was done without public oversight and public accountability. And there's a lot of concerns about what that could lead to because of the possibility that ultimately some of these activities could be undertaken privately without public say, without say by government over what goes on.
Look, quite frankly, our society couldn't operate anymore, and people would be dying on the street without the private support of NGOs and all that kind of stuff. And if you now see what's going on in science, it's not very different. A lot of the science, even academic, is already funded by private. And so let me give you an example. We sort of, worked on this for 6 years. What we're making is a sort of like a snowblower, but the particles, the droplets that come out are 1,000 times smaller, okay? So we thought it was ready for, it isn't quite ready yet, but anyway. So the University of Washington, as was always the plan, is taking this over. And they have two intentions, essentially. One is to study the clouds with this, because they could make and shape the clouds with this and study them like they never done before, and then look at geoengineering. But so we're looking for, wherever the money comes from at this point. And what it really comes down to is that we take each one of these sprayers, sprays a half a glass of seawater, okay? That's what it does, all right? Would you need permission to do that normally? I mean, you spray this and that, we dump 30 gigatons in the atmosphere, or 35 every year, and no one asks for permission. So, but in the interest of the controversy, we will seek permission and say, this is the test. You have to have total transparency because of what's happened in the past. People did these tests and they say, we're going to get carbon credits out of this. Well, sure, you're going to get carbon. They turn around very quickly. So you have to have the moral ground to say, look, this is the experiment that we're going to do, and we'd like to have approval from a competent body.
What if this technology, Alan, gets in the hands of a rogue state or a group that is not as well intentioned as governed as Armand Neukermans just said? Could this technology spread like nuclear technology and get in the wrong hands?
So I think it's really different than nuclear technology, right? Nuclear technology, when you wanted to learn how to make a bomb, the technology was extremely sophisticated and difficult. Here, the technology is actually kind of simple.
There are some parallels with nuclear technology. I mean, I agree it's very different in certain ways, but there is the possibility of dual use. That is, just as nuclear could be used peacefully for energy and then for weapons purposes, similarly, you could see some of the technology that's being developed here potentially being used in a military way, or at least in a way to disadvantage one's neighbors whom one disagrees with. So there's the possibility of that dual use or the possibility of misuse. And I think the key seems to be that if you ultimately did want to go forward with geoengineering, you want to do it well. But with kind of the evil use, you don't necessarily have to do it well, right? You may not care about the side effects that we might be cared about, or the negative environmental impacts that might follow from one of these techniques.
Jane Long, is it moral to do this research into changing the sky in a hubris kind of godlike way, or maybe it's immoral not to do it?
I think it's immoral not to do it. I think that we have created a situation for our offspring, and my grandchildren, your grandchildren, they're the people that will come after us, that could be untenable. And it's part of taking responsibility. I think we have to take responsibility for the earth, because that's where we all live, and because that's where our children and their children are going to live. And so the need to learn how to take responsibility is paramount in our survival.
I think the concern comes with our ideas about our relationship with nature. We like to think, and maybe we would like for the world to be basically a natural place where we carve out a little man-made part in this natural world. And this idea that humans are managing the entire planet and there's fundamentally no more nature is a concept that we need to grapple with, and I think is disturbing to people, and rightfully so.
Man's dominion. Albert Lin.
Ultimately, we move down this road where we've invested so much, where we've created vested constituencies, whether it's companies or scientific communities that are interested in going forward because they have a personal or financial or professional stake in moving forward with the actual deployment and not just the research. I think that's a very real danger we have to be aware of and be concerned with, assuming that field research does go forward.
Jane Long, once funding starts flowing to universities and labs, they want to keep that money flowing. They want to see their papers published, and they have their career is staked on that success.
That's right. And I think these are real problems. And these are some of the more difficult vested interest problems we have. We also have, people that just really want to save the world, and I'm really glad they do, and they want to come up with good ideas, but they need to be checked.
And Ken Caldeira, if we started this geoengineering, again, at Climate One today, we're talking about painting the sky and putting aerosols and making clouds brighter so they reflect heat up into the atmosphere and cool the earth. Once that started, if it stopped, what happens?
If a system were deployed full scale and then stopped right away, it would be a lot like a volcanic eruption, which puts material into the sky and then it falls out. If you kept doing it for a few decades and then and it was masking lots of warming, as soon as you stopped, all that masked warming would come at you pretty rapidly, and so you'd see very rapid warming. And so there would be incentive to try to phase it out slowly if it wasn't working. You wouldn't want to turn it off all at once.
So does the possibility, Jane Long, of a quick technological fix mean that we can go about our carbon-intensive lives and keep driving big cars and flying around and eating steak and I can take a pill later. I don't have to diet. I can get gastric bypass surgery or whatever it is and live happily?
There's just no silver bullet here. And basically, these technologies are not going to work if we keep emitting. I think one of the most important things about climate science that most people don't understand is that all that carbon dioxide that we put in the atmosphere stays there for a really, really long time, like 1,000 years before it decays. And so if we stop tomorrow, if we stop emitting tomorrow, we still have everything that we've put up there to deal with, which is continuing to warm the earth. So if you keep emitting and you keep emitting, you can't keep up with it with any of these technologies. The only thing that we can think about is this might take the edge off for a while we finish this energy transition that we have to make. And maybe we have to go farther. Maybe we find that not only is that energy transition not enough, but we have to take some of that carbon dioxide that's up in the atmosphere now and take it out. But the first thing and the most important thing is the energy transition. If you don't do that, nothing else is going to work.
It's very easy to say, well, we're working on this thing, this geoengineering, we're doing more research, and when the research comes, we'll fix the problem. And it's much easier to say that than to say, well, we need to do this energy transition much sooner, and we need to invest the money up front.
But the fact is, even having this conversation is controversial in some quarters. Some people think, don't talk about it, because if you talk about it, it might happen. That would be bad, so shut up.
There are people who think that this conversation is a distraction away from the more important conversation about how do we change our energy system. But I think it really motivates the discussion about changing our energy system, because if you think about these solar geoengineering options, you recognize that if we continue dumping our greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and forever put more and more aerosols in the sky, that's an ugly, ugly end game. And so these things don't get you out of the need to change our energy system. And I think that once everybody recognizes that we need to change our energy system, maybe we might actually do it.
We're talking about painting the sky at Climate One. Let's go to our audience questions. Welcome.
Given the pace of research and what we saw in cloud seeding, the tendency for charlatans or snake oil salesmen to get involved in a business like that, is it likely that any attempt at geoengineering will come from that angle first on a reasonable scale and either destroy the reputation of it, or that we will then have to try and get a handle on that regulatorily before we even have the option of addressing the real climate issue?
We'd like to tackle that, the idea of hucksters getting into geoengineering, helping farmers. That's
I think it's possible, but I think there's a lot of things that are futures that are possible. So imagine that the world becomes a place where the enemy is climate change and the military is out there fighting the enemy. I mean, maybe that'll happen too. I have no idea.
The real silver bullet, as we all know, is a carbon tax. If you raise a carbon tax to $150 a ton, you will quickly take a lot of carbon out of the system. You will quickly generate the kind of economic change and technological innovation that we need to do this. Most climate models forecast those kind of temperature changes 50 to 100 years out. 50 to 100 years is a lot of time for technological change and energy efficiency in a lot of other areas. So I want to push back against some of the scare tactics I'm hearing up there. We are not in an emergency and we don't need a silver bullet.
I think we all agree that an energy system transition towards a clean energy system is what we need, and that I'm not saying that we're ever going to need to deploy these kinds of things, and there's a tale of distribution of how bad climate change might be, and in my central expectation, we're never going to need any of these kind of global scale technologies, and there's some chance off on the tail of the distribution, and I think it's worth investigating. But I did an op-ed in the New York Times, and I said even in terms of research dollars, at least 99 cents of every dollar should be going towards an energy system transition, and this should be a little minor component. In terms of deployment, it's probably thousands of times more in energy system transition, and so I think we would be happy to be here talking about the need for energy system transition without even mentioning geoengineering.
You're absolutely right. I mean, it's primarily about carbon, and we have to focus our policies on carbon, and we need a price for carbon. We have to, that's a sine qua non. And if we don't do that, there's nothing else there.
Let's go to our next audience question at Climate One. Welcome.
I'm curious, are these radical schemes being funded by the fossil fuel industry?
No.
Yeah. No? Anyone else?
I mean,
Albert Lin?
I don't have anything to add to that except to say that there is a concern that they have an incentive to support these sorts of schemes or ultimately deployment. So yes, in terms of,
because it allows them to continue business as
usual and profits as usual.
So oil companies probably not fighting geoengineering. It helps them continue this business model longer.
Yeah, I think they're savvy enough with their public relations. I think if they could fund it and get away with it, they might, but I think they realize it would be a public relations disaster.
I mean, they'll say things, like the president of Exxon said that climate change is just an engineering problem and we'll get over it. And they say things that make them suspicious.
Up ahead, greening China. Mark Clifford, let's begin with a very interesting character that you write about in your book. He studied physics in Australia, and he thought about opening a Chinese restaurant, but he did something else that had a profound impact on what we're talking about today.
Yeah, well, thanks, Greg, and thanks, everybody, for coming out. Xu Zhengrong started a company called Suntech. He went back to China, got some help from the local government to build a solar panel factory, and within a couple of years, he'd listed on the New York Stock Exchange, become the biggest solar company in the world, and completely changed the face of solar energy. He was one of many Chinese companies, but the biggest, which basically brought down the price of solar from a luxury to almost a giveaway commodity. Solar prices have fallen 95% or more in the last decade or so. It was because of people like Xu Zhengrong. There wasn't a happy ending, though, because he went bust. So it's, the dynamic in China is unbelievable. Chinese manufacturers are changing the world in solar, in wind, in electric cars, as Stella will tell us about. But, there are some ups and some downs. It's an entrepreneurial and difficult business sometimes.
What do you take from the Suntech story and the solar story in China?
Well, I think the story of Xu Zhengrong, his and Suntech, I mean, in many ways, bespeaks, I think, of the immense dynamism in China, but also the incredible instability, and that people of his intelligence, the size of his company, can sort of come and go virtually overnight. And of course, this can happen in any country in business. But I think that there's an object lesson here about how in a country that is sort of reinventing itself so profoundly, there is this tremendous market instability in every realm of life.
Your chairman has stated that BYD will be the world's biggest car producer by 2025. Is that ambition still in place, or has that been modified?
Yeah, that's ambitious, but it's coming now, because if we change the definition into the EV, actually today, BYD just in June, we already overtook the other competition, become the biggest electric vehicle in the world. And then in next 5 to 10 years, BYD in the electric vehicle side, I think we will still continue to play very strong roles. So because the whole auto industry also is changing from the conventional car to the electric vehicle. So if you see all the roadmap from like a BMW and all the Ford, all the big auto company, in next 5 to 10 years, all their new model will be plug-in hybrid car. So if by that definition, I believe BYD still have a big chance to be the world leader for EV.
And speaking of big ambitions, Orville, Schell, this summer the Chinese stock market has crashed, been a bubble. You've written about that. What lesson can be learned from the from the crash of the Chinese stock market this summer?
I think what we saw there was the collision between the two sort of different sides of China's modern personality. On the one side, the old system, Marxism, Leninism, centralized economy, command economy. On the other side, this kind of very vibrant, market-oriented new economy that sprung up. And these two things just came together like some extraordinary atomic collider when the bubble finally broke. And the government could not resist doing what I think everybody who studies markets knows is a fatal move, move in and intervene and try to prop it up. So I think companies such as your own have these same kinds of dilemmas. On the one hand, there are all these kind of shadowy state controls and state-owned enterprises and things. On the other hand, you have these private companies that are trying to expand and operate according to these other principles. And it's very easy to have a kind of a clash of sort of economic civilizations, if you will.
Mm-hmm. Mark, Clifford, does that raise questions about the legitimacy or the sort of the credibility of the Chinese state?
I think when one looks at the track record of China since 1978 and reforms began, it's extraordinary. And we can look at companies like Suntech, which show the instability, but we can look at companies like Goldwind, which is now the world's second largest wind turbine maker, or companies like BYD. And yes, there's a very difficult interplay between state and private sector, but what's going on in China in the environmental area is real, whether it's environmental policy or the clean tech companies.
And is climate and clean energy an existential top-tier priority issue for the Chinese government, Orville, Schell, or is it something that's lower down the ranks, as it is in the United States? Many Americans don't consider environmentalism in a top 5 issue. Most American voters don't.
We have a tremendous amount of anti-scientific prejudice, whereas China is ruled by technocrats, people who grew up in that world, and there is much less sort of doubtful attitude about, I think, science and technology is the motor force of the future. So in this sense, I think China does have an edge over an awful lot of aspects of American society which don't believe in climate change, don't believe in evolution. They don't believe in any of the modern affectations that we once thought were very American.
Orville, Schell, there's been a staggering number of people, a couple 100 million people who've moved into the middle class, into China's cities, out of poverty, another 300 million people behind them. How China urbanizes will have a big impact on the global economy, certainly the global climate. Tell us about how that's going to shape out and what the role of the personal car is going to be in that.
We forget at our peril that the problem confronting China is staggering. And they had several decades of really reckless development, which did some destruction, which is not going to be so easy to repair. For instance, you see various percentages of the land that has been polluted, that has been made toxic with polluted water is very high. You hear 20%, 25%, 10%, different figures. That's going to take a long time to clean up. So these things we have to bear in mind this problem is enormous. And a lot of people and tremendous amount of numbers on small amounts of arable land and limited amounts of resources. What I really worry about, though, is not cleaning up water and air. We know how to do that. What I worry about is cleaning up carbon emissions and greenhouse gases. That is a staggering task, which I don't think any country has a handle on. But I do think that in cleaning up air pollution, there is an opportunity also through things like electric cars, wind power, all the conventional things you know about, to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. So I think while they don't have as powerful an instinct, because it's not as immediate a problem as these conventional kinds of pollution, I think they're certainly not against it, and there is a great opportunity to do these things together.
Stella Lee, what do you think? Is China going to solve both or just solve the more conventional pollution problem that people see?
So now China has a different mindset, and then we have a resource, we have money, then we have people, we have a business opportunity. So this will happen. In next 20 years, you will see the green kind of economic will be the major engine for Chinese GDP growth.
Mark Clifford, Warren Buffett owns about 10% of BYD. What do you make of that?
If Stella and her boss, Mr. Wang Chuanfu, can solve the storage problem, the battery problem, then we've gone a long way towards making things like solar and wind really part of the grid, and we don't need to build as many coal-fired power plants. So I'm not going to second guess Warren Buffett, although I know he's made a lot of money since he invested back in 2008 in the company. But I think, again, there are so many companies doing so many exciting things in China. It's, I'll let Warren Buffett try to pick the winners.
And Orville, Schell, one of the good news that came out was the U.S.-China pact last year, where President Obama and the President of China basically changed the international geopolitics of climate and did a deal. They're the two biggest emitters. About half of the global emissions come from those two countries. What's the significance of that deal?
U.S.-China relations of late have not been particularly good, and I would say have every potentiality of getting worse. However, the bright spot is cooperation on climate change. And I think if we can elaborate out from that, it has the chance of actually helping the global climate change problem as well as helping U.S.-China relations.
Because it's voluntary, non-binding, a next U.S. president could come in and take a different course, whereas is it fair to say China might be more likely to stay the course once they set it or not? Is that naive?
So this is really a crapshoot. And I do think that's one of America's great problems is presidents come and go and policies come and go, whereas China has a nice 5-year plan. We used to laugh at 5-year plans. Now I think we have a kind of a new respect for them.
Mark Clifford, you write about some real success stories, innovation stories in your book. Manila Water was an interesting one because it provides water to residents in Manila and also return to shareholders. Tell us that one.
Well, Manila Water is a great success story, but it reflected the unfortunate fact that the Philippines government couldn't really supply water to the residents of a fast-growing capital city. And they gave 2 concessions out. One of them worked spectacularly well. One of them didn't. So just privatize it is no easy answer, especially for something as sensitive as water. But Manila Water was able to start a virtuous circle where a private company got the concession, invested a lot of money in effectively giving everyone water, and then actually collecting money from the people who were taking the water. In the past, most of the water had leaked or been stolen. And so these things can happen. The private sector can really solve problems. And that's one of the points of my book, is that if government policies can work with private sectors and work with civil society, businesses can often solve really granular problems, like getting water to your house. So when you turn on the tap, water comes out. But tough, still tough.
Is that going to be the trend in Asia where everything's a product commercialized? A lot of people in the United States worry about the privatization of water being treated like a commodity and then profit motive getting in there. That's challenging to some Americans.
I think it's challenging to everyone. You need a strong state. You need strong civil society. You have to have the press. You have to have environmental organizations. That's something India has, China doesn't. So I think it has to be a three-way kind of partnership.
Water is a big concern in northern China, Orville, Schell. There's huge engineering projects to move water up north. The Himalayan glaciers are melting. They provide water to 1 billion people. How's that going to play out?
Well, this is an enormous problem. As you know, China's divided. The north is dry, the North China Plain, the south is wet, south of the Yangtze. So the largest engineering project in world history is the South-North Water Transfer Project to bring water to the North China Plain. There are many problems. A lot of the water is very polluted. It's very expensive. And I think here, actually, there's a really interesting prospect for the state of California, which is now having severe water problems, to maybe collaborate with China to see how do we deal in this century with what is going to be the scarcity of all scarcities, namely water. As weather patterns change, as climate change increases, rivers change their flow patterns.
Mark Clifford, Singapore has become something of a water innovator. They have invested a lot in water innovation. It's not a wet area. Tell us about Singapore's innovation in water.
Lee Kuan Yew, who of course was the founding father of Singapore, just passed away recently. He knew that water was an existential threat, and he and his countrymen have been working for the last 50 years to get water independence, and they've pretty much done that with a combination of desalination, recycled sewage water, collecting every drop that falls, and they're on their own. And like Israel, they knew that they can't survive without water. Unfortunately, big countries like China and the U.S. tend to sort of think there's lots of water around, and I think we have to have a more Singaporean kind of approach. The Chinese and often the U.S. think there's an engineering solution to every problem. And a lot of it is a very human issue of dealing with a real hard stop issue, because when the water comes out, it's finito, right? It doesn't really matter how much money you have if you don't have water.
Orville, Schell, climate will affect some of the most vulnerable people in Asia who contributed least to China, contributed least to climate change. How is that going to be dealt with in China and elsewhere, dealing with these vulnerable populations who are poor, living close to nature, close to the sea?
Well, we just recently at the Asia Society did a map of what things will look like when sea level rises, if all of the ice melts on the planet, and it's not a pretty picture. You lose a good chunk of China, all of Shanghai, the Yangtze Delta, et cetera, et cetera. So the stakes, I think, are very, very high, and many people in the poorest countries will be affected both by rising sea level and also by diminished flows of rivers. As many of you know, all of the great rivers of Asia rise in the Tibetan Plateau, and during certain critical seasons when the monsoon stops, they're fed by glacial melt. You lose the glaciers, you have rivers that don't run all year round, and it was around exactly those rivers that all the great civilizations of Asia have arisen. From the Yellow River to the Yangtze to the Salween, the Mekong, the Irrawaddy, the Brahmaputra, you name it. So this is no kind of small-scale problem. This is basic plumbing for billions of people. And it seems to me that we are just on the precipice of this problem running away so that we can't solve it. And this is why it's so important that the U.S. and China, if they do nothing else, lean into this one.
Could I jump in there? One thing you didn't mention is more frequent and more severe storms. I was down in the...
Or less storms.
Well, or less. But a place like Myanmar had a storm, a killer storm in the spring, May 2008. It killed 138,000 people. The weather changing, that is a matter of life and death for people in Bangladesh, Burma, the Philippines. They are literally on the front lines of climate change. And it is, this is one of the great moral challenges of our time as well, and we forget that it is the people who are the poorest, who did the least to cause this problem, who are the most vulnerable.
What gives you hope?
I believe that human ingenuity and human spirit, and after we've tried everything else, we usually do the right thing. Not always, and I think, unfortunately, there will be many, many more climate casualties, but I think that the U.S.-China agreement, China's recent pledges in the run-up to the Paris climate talks later this year. I feel that, at least we're starting to slowly turn the ship. I mean, it wasn't until 2007 that China even talked about these issues, and now it's become a major focus of Chinese policy. We have a president now who believes this is a serious issue, who believes in science. So, these are the two countries that are going to make it happen. I think our private sector, our governments, and at least in the U.S., civil society will really make a difference.
Let's go to our audience questions. Welcome.
All right, great panel. Thank you very much. Can you talk about the role of nuclear power in Asia and whether nuclear would be a solution for the climate problem in Asia?
Well, I mean, nuclear power is a godsend if you worry about carbon emissions. It's exactly the opposite when they blow up, as we saw in Fukushima. I think that I would be very circumspect, particularly in the case of China, where sometimes construction techniques are not quite up to standards, and management sometimes isn't up to standards. I mean, it's no joke to have a nuclear power plant that goes awry. I think there's much greater opportunity to use renewables like wind and solar. The big problem, as Stella has pointed out, is storage.
Our chairman, Mr. Wang, just make a calculation. If we cover 4% of the global desert with the solar, then all the solar produce enough electricity for for our Earth to use. So it means nuclear just will be a small part of the solution, but in the end, the major part will be wind farm and the solar panel. Especially BYD as the private company demonstrate the technology is here, the solution is here. Now is the next step is how we can really make this change through the policymaker to the utility company to really change the whole industry.
Let's go to our next audience question. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm curious to bring this from a national level to a personal level. So I hear about people complaining about the air. My parents live in Sichuan, so every time I hear about them talking about the air quality is so bad, they live in suburb, but they go to the city to work. I hear a lot about these complaints, but not enough on their side of doing something. They always complain about air quality being bad in the factories and everything else, and it seems to be a problem always on a national level instead of awareness level on an individual, awareness issue on an individual level. So curious to hear, when you guys visit the country, what are people there actually talking about on an individual level, and if anyone is actually doing anything about it other than just complaining about what the government is doing?
Individual awareness is wonderful, but what really matters are structural changes. And one of my worries is that the Chinese state, the government, and its policy-making apparatus has been captured by special interests. It happens in China just as it does in many countries. And the energy complex, the energy companies in China are very powerful, and yet they're not free. They're not free to set realistic prices, so pricing for electricity and everything else is really cheap, and it's cheap because they keep burning coal.